Hi folks, welcome back from spring break. Obviously by welcome back, I guess I mean welcome back to your own homes, as that's where we're going to be teaching from now on. Everything is locked down and we're doing only online teaching for now. So I hope you bear with me through this strange time. We're going to try to continue as normal or as close to normal as possible. And this week, in week 10 of our cognitive psychology course, we're going to be looking at imagery and imagination. Now, there's going to be a little bit of overlap between this topic and some topics that we've covered already. For example, attention and in particular, memory. So there'll be some chances for you to refresh your memory and do some revision. Also, another thing I should point out, for some reason, when the video gets produced, my mouse is over further to the left than it was when I'm actually filming. So I'll try to accommodate for that, but just be aware that when I use the mouse, might not always be pointing at what I am trying to point at. Okay, so here's what we're going to be looking at in this lecture. I want to start with giving you a couple of really interesting findings that come from research on imagery and imagination. There's not necessarily going to be theoretical substance to these early demonstrations, but they are just that, demonstrations and illustrations, neat little examples of what can happen when human imagery and imagination is activated. And then we're going to look at the development of theory of mind, because theory of mind is an incredibly important human psychological capacity. And I do emphasize human because as far as I'm aware, we don't see it in any other creature. It is the capacity to imagine what's going on in somebody else's mind, to recognize that they might not have the same thoughts and feelings and knowledge and awareness that you have, and they might actually have incorrect beliefs, incorrect knowledge, and so on. And then finally, we're going to look at a theoretical perspective of visual imagery and the hows and the whys of imagery. Okay, so when it comes to mental imagery, what we are doing is we are recreating the sensory world without the actual stimuli. So remember the topic of sensation that we covered, right? Your senses are stimulated by information in the environment. So your visual senses are stimulated by electromagnetic waves of the visual spectrum, and your tactile sensation is stimulated by a gush of wind, or when you touch something soft versus hard, or whatever it might be, right? And so your senses pick up that information, and that information travels via interneurons to the spinal column, or ultimately to the brain in most cases, and you process that information. Well, imagery is similar, but without the actual sensory stimulation. So we can imagine that sensory stimulation, even without it actually happening. We can imagine what it's like to feel a sudden gush of wind, or to touch something hard versus soft, or to see bright light versus a red light or blue light, or whatever it might be, right? So even though we're not currently sensing the information, we can imagine it, and this is for any sense. So when we talk about imagery, we usually think about visual imagery. After all, we refer to images. Pictures are images, sounds are not images, really, in typical English language. But in psychology, imagery can refer to a lot more than just visual imagery. So we can imagine movement, motoric imagery. We can imagine touch, haptic imagery. So, haptic, think about your cell phones. There's an option you can choose haptic feedback. That means it vibrates when you touch a button, right? So haptic refers to that type of phenomenon. We can imagine sounds, right? You can imagine the voice of parents or siblings or friends and so on and so forth, or politicians, celebrities, and so on. Right. Now, most research is done on visual imagery. That is what we are going to focus on today. Obviously, there's a lot we could cover on imagery. So to simplify things, we're going to focus on visual imagery. Okay, I want to give you a neat little example to kick things off. So one of the most common images that we come across is this two-dimensional image of the globe. Now, obviously, the globe is not actually two-dimensional. This is what's called the Mercator projection. And it's just that. It's a projection. It's not necessarily representative of the actual thing. And obviously, you know, a two-dimensional map is going to skew and distort things from the original spherical structure. So let's have a look at, let's consider a question. Does it take longer to fly from South Korea to Dallas, or to fly from South Korea to Atlanta? Now, most of you would be saying it would take longer to fly to Atlanta. Atlanta's over here. I'm going to try to adjust my mouse location so that it lands in the right spot, right? And then Dallas is obviously over here. But what if I told you it's actually faster to fly from South Korea to Atlanta if we go this route? Well, let me show you the flight path that I took last year flying back from South Korea. The flight to South Korea from Dallas took a certain amount of time, and then I noticed that it was actually a shorter amount of time getting from South Korea to Dallas, and so I looked at the flight path, and this is what I saw. So there we see that when we alter the image that we use to represent something, in this case, the globe, well, we can see things from a very different perspective, obviously. We can see reality more clearly. And then we realize that some of the images that we rely on, in this case, the two-dimensional representation of the globe, can lead us to certain imagery that can lead us to kind of depart from reality, you know, not recognizing distances accurately and so on. So the images we use are very important. That's just one little example of that. Now, here's a really neat study that I want to discuss, just to get the ball rolling again on, you know, imagery, why it's important, and how it reveals interesting aspects of human psychology. Now, in this particular section of the lecture, I want to focus on how imagery can affect attitudes, right? Thinking about certain people, certain social groups, certain things you like or dislike, this can affect your attitudes about those things and about other related phenomena as well. So let's check this paper out. So they're looking at mental representations of atheists and religious believers. So what they did to begin with was they developed a base face. So this face over here on the left that was just pretty neutral, and it was a blend of some basic characteristics of, I think, male, female, and Caucasian African American. Obviously, they could have, you know, included a number of other races and so on, and gender identities, but they have to kind of keep things simple for the sake of experimentation. And then the the base face was distorted in various ways using certain variables to create a wide variety of different faces. And in the end, there were actually 800 different faces that they came up with. Participants looked at all of these faces and they simply had to determine, they had to make a binary decision. Is this face more likely to be a religious believer, or is this face more likely to be an atheist? And so many participants made these decisions over 400 trials, because there were 800 pictures, 400 picture pairs, so 400 trials, and these were the average faces that participants came up with. Some participants were atheists, some participants were religious. And then a second sample judged these faces in terms of various traits, and as you can see, so obviously this face was judged more religious, this face judged less religious, even though the participants didn't know. In this second sample, they didn't know how the faces were originally devised. Morality, trustworthiness, warmth versus coldness, and so on and so forth. We can see that the imagined face of a theist is deemed much more likable than the imagined face of an atheist. So imagery has an overlap with stereotyping, right? When you stereotype a particular group, when you stereotype your own group even, right? Think about the stereotype of a typical American, for example. Even though this is a country of 330 million people, and a very, very diverse country, some images will still come to mind of what a typical or a stereotypical American will look like. So we have stereotypical imagery in our mind that we hold on to, that we carry around with us across different situations, and these affect social judgments, attitudes, and so on. Okay, and so for another piece of evidence that imagery can affect attitudes, social attitudes, judgments, and so on, let's look at some research that I have done with my colleague Dr. Kimberly Rios at Ohio University. In this pair of studies, we were looking at what would affect perceptions of threat from Muslims. So we're looking, negative stereotypes and prejudice and that sort of thing, right? So for example, an item that was included in this scale was, for example, Muslims don't respect the Constitution as much as other Americans, or Muslims will never understand what it's like, what it means to be an American, stuff like that. So perceiving threat from this out-group to the in-group, that's what we're measuring. How much do people agree with those statements, right? And then we had two separate studies. Now, in each study, there were 3 conditions. So we were interested in seeing what happens when people imagine a typical atheists, and then we had some control conditions. We chose another religion, which is also, somewhat of an out-group in the American cultural and religious context. Most Americans are Christian, America being founded on Judeo-Christian values, and so on and so forth. Well, atheists are an out-group in that context. Mormons are kind of an out-group as well. And then we had just another kind of bland, generic control group. And then in this study, well, now it's singular. That may or may not make a difference, but hey, we're generalizing, right? We're using different methodology to see if we get the same effects, right? Now we've got a typical Buddhist instead of a Mormon, so it's just another social group of comparison. If results are the same across studies, well, then that suggests the effect generalizes. It doesn't matter exactly what control group we choose. And then here's a typical Sunday afternoon. This actually has a little bit of a religious prime in it, somewhat. So anyway, here are the results. The control condition, perceived threat from Muslims participants, about 4.2, 4.3. And then these control conditions, pretty similar results, again about 4.3. And then finally, the atheist condition. Now just stop and think for a second. Which way do you think this is going to go? It actually went down, right? So a perceived threat from Muslims went down after participants were imagining atheists, or a typical atheist. And the theory behind this that we are exploring is that what happens when participants imagine atheists, these were Christian participants, I should stress. What happens is they were thinking about an extreme outgroup. And then when it comes to judging a rather less extreme outgroup, Muslims who also believe in God, much like the Christian participants we had, well, that outgroup is now seen as less extreme compared to the atheists that they were just thinking of, so they perceive a little bit less threat having just been thinking about and imagining atheists. So anyway, that's just another neat example of the role of imagery, in this case, our social psychology. Another cool example, here we've got personality and social psychology. What happens when we imagine other people, and those other people are either unspecified or they are friends of ours? Does this affect how we view the self versus how we view other people? So in this study, researchers looked at reaction times, as well as reaction accuracy, but we're not going to go into that. They looked at reaction times in response to associations of self and positive versus other and negative, and then then they flipped it, self and negative and other and positive. So what happens is, we've looked at the implicit association task before in a previous lecture. Participants look at the middle of the screen, and then they're told, if you see a word related to yourself, like your name or whatever, click the left button. If you see a positive word, click the left button. Or if you see a word related to other people, or if you see a negative word, click the right button. And then in the other trials, they've just switched it, so self and negative goes on the left and other and positive goes on the right. And so they're looking at reaction times. Some participants do this one first. Some participants do self and positive first, some participants do self and negative first, and so on. So then we look at reaction time. How quickly are people to associate self and positive and other and negative, and vice versa. So when the other person is unspecified, well, then there's clearly a bias. People are quick to react to self-positive and other negative, and they are much slower to react to self-negative and other positive. However, when the other person is a friend of theirs, the reaction time to self-positive, other negative is roughly the same as it was before. However, the reaction time to self-negative and other positive has gone down quite a lot, presumably because they have positive feelings towards the friend that is being invoked in this activity. So our social attitudes are, how do we compare ourselves to other people? Imagination can be affected, can affect this as well. Okay, what about imagination and self-esteem? How do you feel about yourself in relation to other people? So much like we just saw in the figure before. How do you feel about yourself in relation to other people when, for example, I ask you to imagine Santa Claus, a happy, jolly, friendly, generous, kind person who's associated with, the happiest time of the year and everything? Or what happens when I get you to think about the complete opposite of that, Adolf Hitler? So let's see what happens to your self-esteem and your social attitudes when you've been imagining really good or really bad people. So the same researcher looked at response time and exactly the same methodology that we discussed in the previous slide here. So when people are thinking about an unspecified other, or when they're thinking about Hitler, the difference in reaction time is pretty similar across those two events. So that suggests that when we think about unspecified others, it suggests that we tend to compare ourselves in a favorable way against other people, because even when that other person is somebody so bad as Hitler, there's really not that much difference in the size of the difference of the effects here than when we're thinking of just like some unspecified other person. So it seems like, thinking about like thinking of ourselves as being better than the average person, because obviously we're almost all of them, pretty much all of us are better than Hitler, right? We usually think of ourselves as better than other people, or more associated with positive. But then when we think about Santa, that difference goes down quite a bit. Our reaction time to self-negative and other positive goes down. We are a little bit more likely now to see ourselves as maybe not so good compared to other people, and other people might be a little bit better now compared to us, in contrast to when the other people, Hitler or just unspecified. So thinking about a nice, jolly, friendly person, suddenly this leads us to see ourselves maybe with a bit more humility relative to other people. So anyway, that's some neat little examples of how imagery and imagination can affect even our social attitudes. Well, now let's look at mind perception and theory of mind. This is obviously extremely important for understanding how imagery and imagination come into being. So let's imagine this situation. A man enters the kitchen, and while watching TV, he pours coffee all over the counter. How do you interpret his actions? Obviously, we assume he didn't mean to do that, because most people, don't want to pour coffee all over the counter. We would, typically see his actions as he meant to pour coffee into the mug, and he just made a mistake, right? That was probably your assumption. Well, there's a whole host of other assumptions you could have made. Why didn't you make those assumptions? This is actually a more interesting question than you think, because we have the mental hardware and the mental circuitry to be able to make this really simple and easy judgment reflexively without even thinking. And so let's look at that mental hardware. We have what is called theory of mind. So we understand that others have different minds from us, and we have some capacity to actually read other people's minds. And I say mind reading in quotes, obviously. We're not reading it like it's a book. We're really inferring, we're intuiting, making inferences, trying to figure out what's going on in other people's minds. We will never know with 100% certainty or with 100% accuracy, but we can pick up some pretty informative cues from facial expressions and from eye movements and so on and so forth. So let's look at some early evidence of this mind reading ability. So theory of mind involves recognizing the mental states of other people. So the state that they are in mentally, the state of their mind. So there are various psychological phenomena that we can infer in other people. And when you stop to think about it, we infer other people's intentions, emotions, desires, and beliefs all the time. Just try to notice it in your day-to-day life. Maybe for the rest of today, spending time with family or friends, or might be a little bit harder in the current coronavirus climate. But maybe on online interactions, think about how readily you infer people's motives and intentions when you're looking at political posts on Facebook or Twitter, for example. Right? We do this sort of thing all of the time, and it turns out that even infants have some capacity to do this. So by approximately 6 months, infants are able to recognize the goals and intentions of other people. That's incredibly impressive. They can't speak, they can't even walk yet, but they are able to make these types of inferences. So let's look at an example. Infants were presented with these two sets of images. Some infants saw both. In another study, some infants saw only one set of images, other infants saw only the other set of images. And infants had their own little dumbbell in front of them that they could play with. And they saw either a person play with a dumbbell or a machine play with a dumbbell. And what they saw was that the person tried to pull the end of the dumbbell off. It's a toy dumbbell, right? So it's, pieced together and you can pull the ends off and screw them back on again. So the person tried to pull the end off and failed. But also the machine tried to pull the end off and failed. So now the question is, here's our dependent variable. What behavior did the infants do in response? Did they mimic the action exactly and not pull the end of the dumbbell off? Or did they actually pull the end of the dumbbell off? So stop and think about it for a second. What do you expect the results to be? Well, in the second example with the machine, the infants copied the movement exactly. They did not pull the end of the dumbbell off. But in the scenario with the human, the infants did pull the end of the dumbbell off, or at least they were, most of them did. They were more likely to. And the reasoning is that the infants were able to infer the intentions of this human agent, right? Now, when it's a robot doing that action, well, robots or machines, they don't have intentions, right? And the infant was able to distinguish something without intentions from something with intentions and coordinate their response accordingly. So now I want to ask you, a little bit of a tangent. Let's stop and think about a research methodology type of question. Ask yourself this: why did they need the person in the background in the scenario that had the machine? Pause and think about that for a second before I give you the answer. So the answer is they want the two conditions to be as similar as possible, and the only difference is that in the first scenario, a person performs an action. In the second scenario, a machine performs the action. But in this scenario, they also want having a person present. There's a person present in the first scenario, obviously. This way we can have that as a constant across the conditions. And so now there is really only one variable, and that variable is, one independent variable. And that independent variable is who performed the action, the machine or the human. And everything else is the same between the conditions. This way, if we do get a statistically significant effect on our dependent variable, right, we find, as the researchers did find, that infants infer intentions in the human agent but not in the robot, in the machine. Well, this way, because we've controlled our independent variable a little bit more tightly, now we have more grounds to say, yes, my hypothesis was supported and the theory was supported. Infants are inferring intention behind the human's actions and not the machine's actions, and this can't possibly be explained. The results can't possibly be explained by other differences between the conditions, because there were no other differences between the conditions. We've completely ruled that out. The differences in the results across the conditions were definitely due to the differences in the conditions that we wanted to make different. A human performs the actions versus a machine performs the actions, and nothing else was different. Okay, as infants, we even have the capacity to make inferences about moral intention. Now, in the notes section of this particular slide, in the PowerPoint file that I've uploaded on Canvas, you'll see a link to a YouTube video, and I want you to watch that because it presents you with a video that depicts this study. But Kylie Hamlin and colleagues, back when they were at Yale University in 2007, they performed this study. A bunch of other studies as well related to this, but this was the original. So infants were presented with these shapes. there was a Mr. Circle or a Mrs. Circle, whatever you want to call it, that was trying to get up the hill. Infants saw the Mr. Circle trying to get up the hill. Mr. Triangle helped Mr. Circle, but Mr. Square hindered Mr. Circle. These are all agentic because they all have eyes, right? Here, everything's agentic now except for the ball. Mr. Circle is no longer Mr. Circle. Mr. Circle is just a ball. It's just an inanimate object. But do infants actually pick up on that? And if they do pick up on that, does that actually affect their social judgments, their judgments of these creatures as social agents or as just inanimate objects like the red ball here? So the dependent variable that we're interested in seeing, whether this manipulation affects the dependent variable or not, who do infants choose to play with, Mr. Triangle or Mr. Square? Infants saw these two pictures, or they saw these two, scenarios, or they saw these two scenarios. They only saw these two, or they only saw these two down here. Who do infants choose to play with? So have a think about it for a second. See what you expect the researchers to find. Here are the results, and look at this figure. See if you can interpret it. It'll be a really good exercise for you. So take a pause, and then I will explain the results to you. Okay, so here's our dependent variable on the left. Again, I'm sorry if the mouse is not going where I want it to go, but we see percentage of infants choosing each individual. So how many of the infants chose Mr. Triangle and how many chose Mr. Square? So Mr. Triangle is the black bar, the helper. Mr. Square is the dark gray bar, the hinderer. And then these light gray bars, well, they reflect the helper and hinderer, left and right, helper and hinderer respectively. But now it doesn't really quite make sense to call them helpers and hinderers because they're quote-unquote helping or hindering a non-valenced inanimate object, right? They're helping a ball or hindering a ball from going up the hill, right? Doesn't really make sense to call them helping and hindering. Instead, we can just look down here, push climber uphill, push climber downhill, pushed ball uphill, pushed ball downhill, and so on. So here we see that in this top scenario here with these two events, children at 6 months old or at 10 months old overwhelmingly preferred the helper, right? The black bar here represents the helper, Mr. Triangle that is helping Mr. Circle, who is agentic, he has eyes, right? He has intention, helping him go up the hill. Most infants did not choose Mr. Square. Even some infants might like blue, they might like squares. They chose Mr. Triangle. They were able to recognize that Mr. Triangle was helping and Mr. Square was hindering. Mr. Triangle is probably going to be a nice toy to play with. Over here, though, when Mr. Triangle and Mr. Square were engaging with an inanimate object, well, there was no statistically significant difference in the number of infants that chose Mr. Triangle or Mr. Square. It was 50-50 among 10-month-olds, and among 6-month-olds, it was roughly 50-50. It was statistically not significantly different from 50-50. So that's how we know that infants are actually inferring intention and reading minds, so to speak. In this case, reading minds of, these little toy figures and that they deciding who they get to play with afterwards, right? So when these, Mr. Triangle and Mr. Square are engaging with an inanimate object, well, there's no moral capacity. You can't have a moral relationship with a cup or a pen, right? These are inanimate objects. It doesn't matter really if you help or hinder them, whatever that means. So infants just chose, I like blue, I like yellow, I like triangles, whatever, right? 50-50, thereabouts. But over here, when these same shapes were interacting with a circle that suddenly it had eyes, it looked like it had intention and agency, now infants were picking up on these cues and thinking, oh, Mr. Triangle seems like a nice shape. Mr. Square seems like a mean shape. As a result, most of them choose to play with Mr. Triangle. Okay, now let's look at inferring emotions. We have what's called social referencing. We can use emotional information from other people to make sense of a situation. And this emerges roughly around the 9-month mark. Let's have a look at this example.
Typically in this situation, the baby will check with her facial expression, and then what we do is have the mom either smile, in which case the babies tend to go across, or look afraid, and that affects the babies and they stay back.
The baby looks at the drop, then checks with his mother. The baby drops down and backs away. So even when the drop is shallow, the baby won't cross when warned off by his mother's facial expression. Now, what will happen if the mother smiles?
Once she smiled, he picked up on that and was trying to come across. He turned around and started treating this like a step, but he was definitely trying, and his behavior changed when she smiled and let him know it was okay.
So now ask yourself, from an evolutionary perspective, why we might develop these mind-reading capacities. Does it serve a function? Does it serve an advantage at all? And the clear answer is yes. This infant was very clearly advantaged by being able to infer emotional states in his mother. Now, social referencing, when you think about it, is a very complex skill. We have to not only see that somebody else is engaging in a certain emotion, but we have to be able to recognize what that emotion actually is. And it certainly helps if we're able to identify it as an emotion that we ourselves can experience and have experienced, and then be able to name that emotion in the context of our own experience. It also requires joint attention. You have to follow the eye movements and attentional activities of the other person. And we have to form an association in our minds between the situation that we're in and a particular emotion. So this is quite a complex skill when you think about it, and 9-month-olds are pretty good at developing it. Now, let's look at a related example. We've covered this briefly early in semester. Remember this question, why do only humans have whites in their eyes? Well, some primates do, but it's very rare. Most primates do not have whites in their eyes, and it's very difficult to observe eye movements. But in humans, it's very easy to observe eye movements. So the theory is called cooperative eye hypothesis. The eyes provide an avenue for human social cooperation. Let's look at some evidence for this, or at least let's look at evidence that humans are uniquely kind of magnetized, drawn to looking at other people's eyes, whereas other animals are less interested in looking at each other's eyes. So, Tomasello and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, which is known in some circles for its research on primatology and evolutionary psychology and psychology and biology overlap and so on. So they had quote-unquote participants, unbeknownst to them. They were participating in a study, 40 human infants and then some primates. And there were 4 conditions. The experimenter sat in front of each participant one at a time. And the experimenter either closed their eyes and tilted their head towards the ceiling to look up, exposing their neck, or they kept their head still and just moved their eyes to look up at the ceiling. So eye movements, no head movements. The first one is head movements, no eye movements. The third condition was moving their head and their eyes to look up at the ceiling, right? So tilting their head and opening their eyes to look upwards. And then the final condition was a pure control condition. They just kept their heads still and they looked straight ahead. And so the dependent variable is, what did the participants copy? What did the participants mimic? Apes were more likely to mimic head movements. Infants were more likely to mimic eye movements. So if the researcher closed his or her eyes and tilted the head upwards, infants were less likely to mimic that scenario. But if the experimenter kept the head still but just moved the eyes to look up at the ceiling, that's what infants were more likely to mimic. So this is very clear evidence that even as infants, we are hardwired to pay attention to eyes and to eye movements because, as I've just illustrated with a couple of research examples, the eyes provide a really powerful window for human cooperation, right? I can look at other people's eyes and infer emotion and associate that emotion with a situation, and therefore, be more on guard, be more careful, and protect myself against threats. Or I can look at eyes and recognize, okay, that means this person has intention and desire and so on, right? The experiment we just talked about with the shapes and infants choosing the shapes to play with. Okay, now let's look at the infant's capacity to infer desires in other people. So the question must be asked, when do children develop the ability to recognize that their own desires aren't shared by everybody? They might like some things that other people don't like, or they might dislike things that other people do like. So what happened was a researcher compared different age groups of children. And the researcher had on the table some goldfish crackers, which are, sugary and tasty and so on, and some broccoli. And it's pretty obvious kids are going to like the crackers, they're not going to like the broccoli, except for some rare exceptions, I guess. And so the researcher says, oh, I love broccoli, I really like some broccoli. And of course, the researcher says, goldfish crackers are yuck, I don't like goldfish crackers. So it's exactly opposite to what most of the children would have felt in relation to these foods. And then a little bit later in the experiment, the experimenter asks the child, oh, can you give me, can you bring some food for me? Bring me something to eat, I'm hungry. And so the child goes over to the table and has to bring something back. So our dependent variable is, which food did the child choose? The goldfish crackers, which they like, or the broccoli, which the researcher has said they like? Toddlers around the age of 14 months gave her the goldfish. The toddler is thinking, oh, goldfish crackers are great, broccoli is gross, I'll get her goldfish crackers. It's almost like they've forgotten what the researcher said. That's one possibility. It turns out they're just not very good at imagining the mental and emotional states of other people. They can't comprehend how somebody could possibly prefer broccoli over goldfish crackers. But the 18-month-old was more likely to give her the snack that she said she wanted, the broccoli. So here, 18-month-olds had suddenly developed the ability to recognize that other people might have different desires and preferences to ours. And so, a little bit of a tangent here, but just like when we look at Piaget's research on infants, as well as any research on human adult decision-making and judgment and reasoning and so on, the errors that we see actually reveal a lot about human psychological capacity. Okay, now let's look at inferring emotions. We have what's called social referencing. We can use emotional information from other people to make sense of a situation. And this emerges roughly around the 9-month mark. Let's have a look at this example.
Typically in this situation, the baby will check with her facial expression, and then what we do is have the mom either smile, in which case the babies tend to go across, or look afraid, and that affects the babies and they stay back.
The baby looks at the drop, then checks with his mother. drops down and backs away. So even when the drop is shallow, the baby won't cross when warned off by his mother's facial expression. Now, what will happen if the mother smiles?
Once she smiled, he picked up on that and was trying to come across. He turned around and started treating this like a step, but he was definitely trying, and his behavior changed when she smiled and let him know it was okay.
So now ask yourself, from an evolutionary perspective, why we might develop these mind-reading capacities. Does it serve a function? Does it serve an advantage at all? And the clear answer is yes. This infant was very clearly advantaged by being able to infer emotional states in his mother. Now, social referencing, when you think about it, is a very complex skill. We have to not only see that somebody else is engaging in a certain emotion, but we have to be able to recognize what that emotion actually is. And it certainly helps if we're able to identify it as an emotion that we ourselves can experience and have experienced, and then be able to name that emotion in the context of our own experience. It also requires joint attention. You have to follow the eye movements and attentional activities of the other person. And we have to form an association in our minds between the situation that we're in and a particular emotion. So this is quite a complex skill when you think about it, and 9-month-olds are pretty good at developing it. Now, let's look at a related example. We've covered this briefly early in semester. Remember this question, why do only humans have whites in their eyes? Well, some primates do, but it's very rare. Most primates do not have whites in their eyes, and it's very difficult to observe eye movements. But in humans, it's very easy to observe eye movements. So the theory is called cooperative eye hypothesis. The eyes provide an avenue for human social cooperation. Let's look at some evidence for this, or at least let's look at evidence that humans are uniquely kind of magnetized, drawn to looking at other people's eyes, whereas other animals are less interested in looking at each other's eyes. So, Tomasello and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, which is known in some circles for its research on primatology and evolutionary psychology and psychology and biology overlap and so on. So they had quote-unquote participants. Unbeknownst to them, they were participating in a study, 40 human infants and then some primates. And there were 4 conditions. The experimenter sat in front of each participant one at a time. And the experimenter either closed their eyes and tilted their head towards the ceiling to look up, exposing their neck, or they kept their head still and just moved their eyes to look up at the ceiling. So eye movements, no head movements. The first one is head movements, no eye movements. The third condition was moving their head and their eyes to look up at the ceiling, right? So tilting their head and opening their eyes to look upwards. And then the final condition was a pure control condition. They just kept their head still and they looked straight ahead. And so the dependent variable is, what did the participants copy? What did the participants mimic? Apes were more likely to mimic head movements. Infants were more likely to mimic eye movements. So if the researcher closed his or her eyes and tilted the head upwards, infants were less likely to mimic that scenario. But if the experimenter kept the head still but just moved the eyes to look up at the ceiling, that's what infants were more likely to mimic. So this is very clear evidence that even as infants, we are hardwired to pay attention to eyes and to eye movements because, as I've just illustrated with a couple of research examples, the eyes provide a really powerful window for human cooperation, right? I can look at other people's eyes and infer emotion and associate that emotion with a situation and therefore, be more on guard, be more careful and protect myself against threats. Or I can look at eyes and recognize, okay, that means this person has intention and desire and so on, right? The experiment we just talked about with the shapes and infants choosing the shapes to play with. Now, last but certainly not least, because this is very important, we have to look at the capacity to infer the beliefs of other people. And again, when you think about it, the example I gave earlier in the lecture, we do this all the time when we're interacting with other adults, right? So if somebody, for example, expresses a particular opinion about, let's say, the Democrats, you might immediately assume that they believe all sorts of things about Republicans and healthcare and Trump and, border security and whatnot. You will make a ton of inferences based on that small piece of information. It's really quite a problem in today's society, just how quick we are to assume things of other people. However, this capacity, this ability is really important, notwithstanding these rather negative examples that we do see. It's very important, and it's especially important for infants in their psychological development. Now, beliefs are more difficult to grasp. They take longer for infants to be able to mentalize, at least other people's beliefs, harder to imagine. These beliefs, right? Beliefs can't be observed directly. You have to make inferences of them, or the person has to actually tell you what they are, right? So the example I just gave, somebody expresses a negative opinion towards the Democrats, for example. Well, you don't actually know how they think and feel about all these other related topics. You're making inferences, but you can't know for sure. So they are harder to infer. Compare that to the examples we looked at earlier with, Mr. Circle trying to get up the hill. It was pretty easy to infer that this character had an intention of getting up the hill. But you couldn't really infer that character's beliefs, right? Apart from the belief that getting up the hill is a good thing, that might be the only one that you can infer. So children can't really do this until roughly the age of 3, 4, or in some cases 5 years old. Stop and think to yourself for a second, which children will develop theory of mind first? Which children are more likely to develop the capacity to infer beliefs in other people earlier rather than later? Just think about that for yourself. Okay, so how do we go about testing the theory of mind capacity to infer beliefs? Well, we need evidence that children can recognize that somebody holds an incorrect belief. A belief that's different from reality, because then we can really know for sure that this child recognizes that this other person holds their own belief that's different to that child's own beliefs, because that other person is holding an incorrect belief. So that's really clear evidence that the child is capable of recognizing that their beliefs aren't necessarily shared by others. So let's look at this example.
This is Anne, and this is Sally. This is Sally and Anne's basket and box. And one day, Sally and Anne were playing with a block in their house. And then Sally decided to put the block in the box. And this is Sally. And these are Sally's basket, Anne and Sally's basket and box. And guess what? One day, Anne and Sally were playing with a block in the house. And then Sally decided to put the block inside the box. And then Sally decided to go outside and play, where she couldn't see or hear anything that was happening inside. Bye, Sally. Well, that tricky Anne, guess what she did?
She took it out of the box.
She took the block and put it in the basket. Now, did Sally see Anne move the block?
Because she
No.
was outside
That's right.
swinging.
That's right, she didn't see. So when Sally comes back in, where will she think the block is?
In there, but it's not. It's in there.
So she'll think it's in the box.
Yeah,
Why do you think she'll think that?
Because she put it there.
So as you can see, at different ages, children vary in their ability to recognize false beliefs in others. So in summary, by kindergarten, children have achieved many really important skills related to social cognition. And by social cognition, really, we just mean thinking about other people, thinking about the social world. And they can see intentions, emotions, desires, beliefs in other people. They can infer them by eye movements or by facial expressions and so on and so forth. Okay, now finally let's take a theoretical perspective looking at visual imagery. So I'll give you some demonstrations. Just try these out in your own time. So the function of imagery, one of the functions is that it helps us solve problems, obviously. For example, we can plan moves in a game, we can plan trips to the store, or, we can even, imagine the emotional reaction of somebody we plan to have an argument with, and we can plan our argument accordingly, right? So imagery, imagination, these obviously really help with planning, problem solving, and, in short, getting things done. We can plan strategies and whatnot. Imagery also aids memory. It's easier to remember things when you can have a mental image of it, or if you can imagine, rehearsing a phone number in your head. Well, that is auditory imagery. You're imagining the sound of the phone number, and maybe imagining the shape of the numbers and that sort of thing can help as well. For example, the more you try to imagine your house, the better chance you'll have of answering this question correctly. Of course, you might want to go and actually have a look at the house to get some help, and so on and so forth, right? What hand does the Statue of Liberty hold her torch? The answer is the right hand. So anyway, imagery is easier for concrete things than for abstract things, right? This should be pretty intuitive, right? But this finding reveals some interesting things about imagery from a theoretical perspective, which we'll cover shortly. So under the dual coding hypothesis, dual coding is in we code two different things separately. There are two systems of representation in the mind. We have representation of verbal or abstract concepts. So for example, justice, warmth, brightness, right? These are relatively abstract things. Loneliness, that's an abstract term. But we also have very relatively concrete things that we can imagine, and we can use our visual imagination for this, right? Like, so rather than imagining, for example, this concept of justice, you can imagine Lady Justice or a courthouse or something like that. Rather than imagining this vague concept of brightness, you can imagine sunshine and visualize sunshine, for example. So participants in one study had to learn a list of pairs of nouns, much like we did in our own study, learning a list of word pairs, and they had to recall them later. And they were divided into 4 conditions. The participants either had to recall a list of words in which the word pairs, both words in the pair were concrete, they were things, so to speak. But then some participants also had to recall an abstract word in that word pair. And some, the abstract word came second, and some, the abstract word came first. And then this final condition, both concepts were abstract. And as you would expect, if you're recalling 2 concrete words, participants did better. Participants did pretty well if they were recalling a concrete and then an abstract word. But 2 abstract words, that's bad. What's interesting here is abstract then concrete is much worse than concrete then abstract. So basically, chair and justice is easier to remember than freedom and dress. So the theory is that we kind of use the first word as an anchor or a peg, a conceptual peg. We peg our imagery on that, and the first noun serves as an anchor or a foundation, a foothold or a peg, that we can then use to remember the next word. But when it's, for example, abstract and then concrete, well, the first word doesn't really help us to get that kind of peg or that foothold quite as much as it did when the concrete word came first, right? You can imagine a chair, and then on that chair, you can imagine justice-related concepts. It's a bit harder to imagine freedom and then associate a dress with that imagined freedom. How are images represented in the mind? This is another important theoretical question. And what we just covered, concrete things being easier to imagine and represent mentally than abstract things, well, that helps answer this question, as we'll see. So, on the one hand, we have depictive representational theory. Images are analogous to things that we actually see, right? It's primarily visual, and imagining something in our minds is just like actually seeing it. So for example, if I were to say the ball is on the box, you would actually imagine and picture in your mind a ball on the box. Now that is the intuitive explanation that I think would come to most of us. However, there is this alternative theory called the propositional representation theory of mental imagery. Here, we don't actually visually imagine the items. Rather, we code this imagery in our mind with abstract statements, using abstract or verbal propositional code-like representation. That all might sound a bit vague and confusing to you. Well, that's kind of the point. For example, the ball is on the box. You might have this kind of computer-like representation in the mind, right? Think about, the hardware of a computer, and it uses a lot of binary code, ones and zeros and stuff like that. And with that, it's able to compute and represent some phenomenally complex information on your computer. So it's not impossible that the human mind operates in a similar way. So we have 2 different theoretical perspectives. I'll let you pause and read through this on your own. Now, we're going to focus on evidence in favor of depictive representational theory, as this does have more evidence in support of it. First, I want to look at propositional coding theory and get that out of the way. So some evidence that was initially found in favor of this theory to suggest, maybe this theory is the one that's correct, we recall our memory works differently depending on the semantic or conceptual or abstract label that we apply to the image that we are trying to imagine in our minds and then recall later. So for example, participants were given this stimulus as the actual image that they were given on a sheet of paper and told, memorize this. For some participants, this was labeled curtains in a window. For some other participants, it was labeled diamonds in a rectangle. So now they're not given simply an image or simply visual information. They're given conceptual, abstract, semantic information as well, right? So what do they use to recall this image? Do they rely purely on mental vision like imagery, or does the label, the semantic abstract coding of this information, does that affect recall? When participants read the label curtains in a window, that's typically how they drew the image. And when participants read diamond in a rectangle, this is how they recalled the image, right? So, at least in terms of memory for an imagined image, language, semantics simply means meaning, meaning specifically in linguistics, propositional, abstract, conceptual coding of information. This is implicated in imagination, at least insofar as when people are trying to recall things that they have been imagining. But what about depictive representations? What about evidence for this? So this is research conducted in the 80s by Steven Pinker and colleagues. And so they gave participants this first screen where they see dots laid out in a particular arrangement. And then they saw some other examples, dots were laid out in different arrays. And then the second screen, the dots disappear, and there's an arrow that appears on the screen. And then the participant's task, the dependent variable is, the participant's task is, they have to decide, is the arrow pointing to where a dot was, or is the arrow pointing to a space where there was not a dot? Is the dot in the line of this arrow? And so they have to respond yes or no. The arrow is lined up with the dot, the arrow is not lined up with where a dot once was. And so the dependent variable is reaction time. So how long did participants take to respond with their decision? And it turns out that response time and accuracy was another measurement, did they get it right, yes or no, were significantly, statistically significantly related to the distance between the arrow and the dot. So when the arrow was far away from the dot like this, participants took a little bit longer and they were more likely to make mistakes. Now if the arrow was up here, or if you had an arrow pointing this way, oh I'm sorry, my mouse is probably not clearly showing it right now, but just imagine if the arrow was closer to the dot, well then participants take less time to respond and they're more likely to respond accurately. So this suggests that observers were actually scanning their mental image, and there was a little bit more of a delay when they were scanning a mental image in which the arrow was further away from the dot. So it seems like they are relying on actual visual representation of that image. It's not just propositional code in their mind in abstract form, they are actually trying to reproduce that image in their mind. Some more evidence for depictive representations. Participants in group 1 were told to imagine a rabbit next to an elephant. Participants in group 2 were told to imagine a rabbit next to a fly. As you can see, two very different pictures. Then when participants were asked, does the rabbit have whiskers? Well, participants in the condition in which the rabbit was standing next to an elephant, they took a little bit longer. Why? Well, the theory is, the explanation is, that they had to mentally zoom in to their picture, zoom in on the rabbit to see, oh yeah, I can see the whiskers now in my imagined image of a rabbit and an elephant, right? This condition, they took a little bit less time. It's obviously a very small difference, 2.02 seconds and 1.87 seconds, but it is significantly different. Let's look at some other examples. Participants were given a map and told to memorize it, and then they had to imagine walking between 2 points on the map. So for example, they maybe imagine going from there to there, or they imagine going from there to there, right? And the interesting thing is that, I mean, you would think if this image was simply stored in your mind, or imagined, or invoked, or whatever you want to call it, using propositional, abstract, analog code, or whatever, then it shouldn't, the reaction time of participants shouldn't depend on how far away the locations on the map are from each other. You know, it's like saying, oh, have you going from Cincinnati to Columbus as opposed to going from Cincinnati to Los Angeles, right? Obviously, the first trip is much shorter and much quicker, but in your mind, you know where LA is, you know where Cincinnati is, you know where Columbus is. Do you really need to mentally traverse that map, or can you just say, oh yeah, like, you know, it takes this long to get to LA, that's this long to get to Columbus, and so on. Reaction time is similar. Well, that's not actually what participants did. Their reaction time to the activity of just imagining the trip was longer when the two locations were further apart, and it was almost perfect correlation, right? Now, obviously, this seems kind of obvious that participants would do this, but it's not obvious when you consider the alternative competing theories of mental imagery that we just looked at, the propositional code hypothesis, and that indeed did have some evidence in support of it, right? But from this evidence, it really does seem like participants are actually imagining the trips in their minds. So the Cincinnati, Columbus, LA example I gave you, most of you would actually imagine traveling from Cincinnati to LA, and as part of that imagination, you would actually, you know, you wouldn't just jump there like a teleportation device. You would imagine the trip and how long it would have to take compared to the trip from Cincinnati to Columbus, and then that would influence how long you took to complete the activity. Evidence that we imagine using actual visual information. Another example, participants are presented with this R, and some of them just have to recreate the object, and then others have to rotate the object. And so we compare the amount of time it takes to rotate the object versus just recreating the object, and the amount of time it takes participants to do that, the dependent variable reaction time, corresponds with how different the orientation of the original stimulus was to the end goal, right? So when the end goal is the same as the orientation of the stimulus presented, well, participants don't take very long at all, but when the end goal, that R there, oh sorry, my mouse is probably not working right for you, when that R there is juxtaposed with this R here that's, you know, that's flipped 180, then it takes longer for participants to reproduce that that letter because they're actually rotating it in their own minds, as you can see there. More evidence for depictive representations. Well, the more discriminable, the easier it is to discriminate between two objects, the easier it is to judge which is bigger. So for example, what's bigger, a border collie or an anteater? What's bigger, an ant or an elephant? The latter is much easier, right? And the theory is that it's easier because we're relying on actual visual information rather than just simply semantic coding of, well, the, you know, border collie, anteater, I've coded that as being, you know, a medium animal versus a small to medium animal, and an elephant is a large animal. You've just coded it like that. That's not really how we work. Rather, we try to visualize and imagine the objects, and then we answer the question. Some more evidence. Now, try to imagine a skyline of New York City. Then participants, they were imagining this on a white screen that they were looking at. And then from behind that screen, researchers projected a faint image of a tomato onto the screen. And so many participants say they imagined New York at sunset. It looks kind of like this, right? Because you see that tomato projected onto the screen. That's the influence of that imagery that was provided to them that affected the type of skyline that they imagined in New York. Okay, so in summary, visual imagery uses mostly the same processes as actual visual perception. Now, we didn't cover this, but it actually uses the same brain regions as visual perception. So when you're imagining something and when you're seeing something in reality, you're using your visual cortex, your occipital lobe of the brain. Visual imagery relies on visual depictions. We actually see the image in our minds rather than just mental representation or propositional code. And finally, as we began the lecture with, imagery can affect attitudes, feelings about self versus other, and various other social psychological phenomena. Okay, thank you for listening.